we begin by you telling us a little bit of background about yourself. You were a
Just
nurse.
for the tape, this is Patricia Gustafson. Okay.
Right.
Spelling is Gustafson.
Right.
What's your middle initial?
K.
K.
That's my middle name.
Okay. K-A-Y.
E. K-A-Y-E.
K-A-Y-E. Just by way of your background, you're not a nurse now. You were a nurse.
I'm still an RN, but I'm not practicing.
Right. All right. You were in the emergency. What was your job at the time?
I was just an RN in the emergency room.
Assigned to the emergency room. And how many years had you been working at Parkland?
Well, I went to school there, graduated in '57, and stopped when I graduated to have 2 children, and then went back to work and worked on and off for about 12 years.
So you have a lot of experience.
At the time, had you been working straight through since your graduation, or you had broken off already and then come back?
I stopped for about 3 or 4 years after I graduated and then came back. Worked on the orthopedic ward in the hospital for about 1.5 years, and then transferred down to the emergency room and worked down there on and off for about 7 years, I guess.
What were you doing that day? You were assigned to the emergency room. Could you recreate the events of the day for us as best as your memory can do
The
it?
emergency room is divided off into different areas, and I was working in the area in there. And had gone to lunch about 11:30, I guess, and had gone back to my area after lunch when we were given a call to take a stretcher out to the loading dock. And that's where it began.
You had no idea who this was for at that point? So
On the way out the door, we were told.
I see.
Now, how does it work? The ambulance comes to the loading dock, and then
Well,
you take the...
they had called, as I understand it, they had called the hospital operator first and had notified the hospital, notified the emergency room that there had been an accident and that there were some patients on the way to the hospital.
So you went out of the door, the emergency room, with the stretchers?
With a stretcher.
These are the stretchers on wheels and carts. So who else was with you?
I don't remember. It was a mass confusion. All I know is there were a couple of aides and a couple of orderlies and myself, but I do not remember.
You were the only nurse that went out?
As well as I can remember at that time, yes.
So you went out to the ambulance to greet the president, is that it?
Well, he was still in his car. He was not in an ambulance.
That's right.
That's right. Did you help put him onto the stretcher?
Yes.
You did. You remember what position you were in at that time in relation to his body? Were you near the head, the feet, or what?
All over.
Did you have an opportunity at that time to see what his condition was?
Not generally. We could see that he was bleeding and that he was unconscious, and that was the extent of it till we got him in the emergency room.
You went into the emergency room.
You accompanied the cart in then, the stretcher
Into the trauma room.
along with the orderlies and aides, whoever else was there, into the trauma room.
Were you in the trauma room for the entire time?
Yes.
The president was in there?
Yes.
And what was your role inside the trauma room?
To do what I was asked to do.
Which was?
Various things. We began by putting an endotracheal tube in, and the doctor got set up to do a tracheostomy. And there were, by that time, 3 other RNs in the room and several doctors, anesthesiologists, and everybody was just trying to work as a team and do what we were asked to do.
So during that time, you had a number of other opportunities to actually look at the president and see his wounds and so forth, although obviously you were busy. But is that fair to say that you
examined his head wounds carefully?
So you had quite a long. How much time overall would you say were you in a position where you could see the president and his wounds, some of them or some part of them overall?
I have no idea.
But you had
Time was of no meaning at that time. Nobody was looking at a clock or remembering any time element.
But you had a good opportunity to examine his head wound.
Yes.
Could you describe that for us?
One of the doctors asked me to put a pressure bandage on the head wound, and I tried to do so, and there was really nothing to put a pressure bandage on. It was too massive. So he told me just to leave it be.
Where? And where was the head? Where was the back of the head?
Can you outline with your fingers sort of how, roughly how large you recall it being?
No, it was about the size of my fist, I guess. So.
Should we have her draw it now?
Yeah. We have here a life-size plastic model of a human skull. Do you think you'd be able to sort of draw on that with a pen? I have a pen you could use, roughly where you recall that wound on the head that you applied the bandage to?
Generally, but not precisely.
Okay, I understand, within the limitations of the time that's passed and the limitations of memory.
Somewhere in this general area, as well as I recall. That is not specific.
Okay, you feel it was that low on the head, not higher?
As I said, in the general vicinity.
That's your best memory.
Yes.
Do you recall any sort of wound up and higher up on the side of the head like that? Or?
Not that I could specifically tell. There was a lot of bleeding, and there was no real way of...
Now you're putting the wound in the occipital area of the head, in the back of the head. It appears to be the right rear,
No.
right?
Just in this general area. As I said, I can't be specific about it because I don't remember exactly how flexed back the head was and so on. All I remember is it was in the back.
Okay, just talking for the tape recorder, could you say that you put it in the right rear? Is that approximately where you put it?
Either to the right rear or the right central area.
In the back of the head.
Tell me about when you attempted to put a pressure bandage on that wound. Was the head then lying on its side, or had it been lifted up? What sort of position
No,
was it in?
Just laying on the car.
But to get
A
at
little
that,
bit extended.
extended like that, I see. So you had to reach underneath to try to apply that bandage.
Was it on a brace?
Supported in any way?
Not that I can recall. It
That
may
was in
have
the
been, but I
autopsy.
do not recall.
Right.
So you had to actually lift up the head. You touched the back of his head?
I tried to apply the pressure bandage where I saw the wound, which could have been a little bit higher, relating to his head being extended back somewhat.
Mm-hmm. When he was lying flat on his back with his head on the stretcher, could you see the wound if he was lying flat on his back, or would it require lifting the head up
No,
to
I did
examine
not
it?
lift, as well as I recall, I did not lift the head up.
But could you see it just as it lay there? Was it obscured by the fact he was just lying there? Could you glance at it and see immediately that there was a large...
As well as I remember, I could glance at it to see it.
Uh-huh.
Even though it was on the back of its head and if he was lying down, you could still see it?
Apparently, from my recollection, his head was a little bit over the end of the cart.
Well, actually, off the end of the card, so...
Just somewhat, not totally, but somewhat to get the flexion there.
To get flexion.
Well, because they were trying to,
Oh, I see.
endotracheal tube and do the tracheostomy.
I see. Okay. Do you have any other questions on this before I show her the other picture?
Well, let me just try to darken the line that you drew. Would you still say that that reflects the line you drew?
I cannot say definitely. It has been a long time, number
understand
one.
that.
And number two, I just remember putting my hand there with the pressure bandage on the back area.
Sure. But that I haven't changed the outline that you drew.
No, you have not changed the
Okay.
outline that I drew, but it may not be in the precise
I
area.
understand that.
I don't have the house autopsy. I do. I'm going to show you now a picture that is contained. You're aware that there was another investigation over and above the Warren Commission done by the Congress, the House Assassinations Committee, in the last couple of years. They released their report in 1980, last year. I'm going to show you now from Volume 7 of the House Assassinations Committee final report, a tracing, a drawing of a photograph. And this is the back of the president's head, a tracing of a photograph of the back of the president's head taken during the autopsy. Okay, I want to show it to you, and could you tell me if that resembled the head as you saw it in Dallas minutes after he was shot?
It does not appear to be the same as I remember it. But you must realize too that at the time he came in, there had been extensive bleeding in the back of the head and matted to the hair and so on and so forth, which may distort what your general view of.
But what about the gaping wound that you
As far as
described?
the wound's concerned, I remember it being larger.
Well, is there any wound that you see there in the region?
The only thing that I see that looks like a wound is that area there.
And you're pointing to where, the cowlick area? Up high in the center of the head?
Yeah, not quite that high.
So you,
That would be the cowlick area to
Right.
me. This would be a little bit lower.
On the-
and where you saw, what you recall would be generally the area of that wound you see, but much larger. Is that fair to say?
No, well, she's drawn it lower, haven't you?
I have, and that's why I'm saying that my drawing may not be precisely.
Mhm. But that does not correspond to what you remember as you remember it.
No, it does not correspond with what I remember.
Let me show you, okay, first of all.
Have you ever seen that before?
No, I have not. I have not seen anything on it.
Uh-huh. Which ones? The plain ones?
Yeah, the paper, let's get her to put it on
Oh,
the paper
okay.
too.
Could you try to do, again, recognizing the limitations of memory and everything, could you try to just indicate on this paper drawing the kind of
Same drawing that you made on the
same
skull.
thing you made on the skull? If that's any help, I'll hold it up for you.
See, what we're doing is we're going around and showing this, taking this skull, asking everybody to draw it, but after we get done with you, we erase it, and in case we're
We
taking
photograph
photographs of it, in
Then
case
we
our
erase
photos
it.
don't show us, we want to have this as a backup, okay?
It's harder to do though, and we realize on a flat plane, that's why we have the skull.
Well, I assume it would be somewhere in this general area.
Okay, fine.
That's good.
Would you initial that here somewhere? Okay, fine. I'm going to show you two other drawings now. The first, as you were, a lot of the doctors testified before the Warren Commission.
I haven't read any of that either.
You've not read it?
No.
One doctor who testified, Dr. McClellan, testified in some detail as to his recollection of the location of the rear head wound, or the head wound. Based on his descriptions, an artist prepared this drawing for a book called 6 Seconds in Dallas. Now, Dr. McClellan, I want to emphasize, did not do this drawing, but based on his descriptions, some artist prepared this drawing. Now, does that square with your recollection of the location of the head wound? Or how does it square?
The size of it is what I remember verbatim. The location, as I said, things were done in such a hurry and not remembering exactly the position of the head on the part and how much extension there was to it. I cannot precisely say that's exactly where it was or where I have drawn more in the middle. It was somewhere in the back.
Definitely in the back,
Yes.
not the side then, not the side of the
Not
head.
what I would call the side as being right here.
Looking at the skull again, you don't recall then seeing any kind of a large wound in this area that would be called a parietal bone area?
Not that I can recall.
Another artist who had access to viewing the autopsy photographs. See, the autopsy photographs, so we're talking about maybe 50 or so photographs, have not been released publicly. They're in the National Archives in Washington. Perhaps 100 people have seen them. One person who saw them prepared this drawing showing a gaping wound in the right front side. of the head.
It's
How does
not
that,
front, but side.
well, right side, how does that square with your recollection of what you saw on the president's head?
I don't remember it being in that location.
Okay. Any other questions, Nils, on that? I got some others.
I think not at the moment. Go ahead.
You prepared a report that day of your observations, didn't you? And that was at whose request?
The supervisors.
That was Mrs. Nelson? Do you have a copy of that report?
Yes, I do.
Would you let us see it?
Well, I don't know if I don't mind, but I don't know if I should or not.
There's no problem, I mean, as far as
We
you
never told you you shouldn't.
I have never talked to anybody about it, period. I don't know
Yeah.
what I should or should not.
Well, I can't imagine there's any issue of, violating of confidence. All the other reports that people prepared, that, have been published at one time or another.
come in the public
As part of the, for instance, in the appendix of the Warren Commission, the actual handwritten reports of the physicians were.
But the difference is that those people all were cleared by the FBI, and then I never was, and I'm not too sure whether it would fall back on me in any means if I did. That's my only concern. Because at the closing of the report that I did make, I was told not to answer any questions until I had been cleared by the supervisor, or by the nursing service office through the FBI.
Well, your report has been submitted as part of the Warren Commission evidence. There's a citation for that in this recent book. Are you aware of this new book?
I'm not aware. The only thing I've ever read is the Manchester report.
Okay, there's a new book out by an author called David Lifton.
I've read about that book in the newspaper, but I have not.
You're mentioned here just in passing. Pat Hutton, at that point, your then married name, and he quotes you in your report as saying, Mr. Kennedy was bleeding profusely from a wound on the back of his head. And that's footnoted, and the footnote is a Warren Commission exhibit. So your report is in the public domain to that extent. It's all the evidence that the Warren Commission obtained, or most of it, was released, and it appears in one of the 26 volumes of the report. So we can go back and look it up.
That's what I was going to say. If the report is public, why
well,
not?
I just thought if you had it handy right here now, we could see it. I haven't had an opportunity to look it up. Is it long, or?
No, it's very brief, and that essentially covers the main part of it, about the
Would you read it to
headline.
us?
Yeah, why don't you just read it to us, rather than giving it to us if that's a problem, but just read it to us, okay?
I don't know. As I said, I have never talked to anybody.
This is the first time you've ever been interviewed
That's
since
right.
the assassination.
That's right.
It's the only thing that you communicated to anyone was what you wrote in that.
That's right. But essentially, the report just describes what you said about the head wound, and that I was asked to put a pressure bandage on, and it was of no avail. So that was stopped, and the rest of it just has to do with the activities in the emergency room, such as the doctors administering IVs and doing tracheotomy and that sort of thing. There's no other real talk of the head wound. That was it, what you just quoted.
All right, well, you won't read it. You won't read it into the record. I mean, even if we can.
Well, I do not mind it, except there's nothing more in it, except what you have just
Well, I know.
covered right here.
We're
I'm
just
not trying to be hard and
I
get
know.
along with,
We're
believe me.
we're just trying to touch all the bases
I
and be
know.
complete. Just if it's only 2 paragraphs, we just like to hear what it says, and just
I'll read you the part about the head wound, but that is all that is really in here about it that has any coverage with that. Proceeded to trauma room number 1. Mr. Kennedy was bleeding profusely from a wound on the back of his head and was lying unresponsive. As soon as we reached the room, a doctor placed an endotracheal tube, prepared for a tracheostomy. There were numerous doctors in the room with IVs, chest tubes, anesthesia, and so on. A doctor asked me to place a pressure dressing on the back of the head wound. It was of no use, however, because of the massive opening on the back of the head.
Do you recall who asked you to do that?
No, I do not.
And the rest of the report just
The rest
describes...
of it is just trivia about, waiting for the priest to come and taking the equipment out of the room and waiting until the body left and so on.
During the time you were able to observe the president, was he ever moved into any other position other than lying flat on his back with his head flat back?
Not that I recall.
You don't recall seeing him on his side or rolled over or anything like
Oh,
that?
I'm sure they rolled him over to see if there were any other wounds.
Did you see that happen?
I don't remember it happening. I may have been in there and had my back turned
Sure,
doing
of
something
course.
else.
No, I just wondered whether you recall seeing him in any other position other than flat back.
I don't. I'm sure, as I said, when he first came in, that they turned him over to see if there was anything on the back and so on before they proceeded on.
Do you remember when you started reading accounts, if you did, say, of the Warren Commission report, were you ever struck by any discrepancy in what those accounts were describing as far as his wounds and what you remembered?
Yes, I don't feel like the description of the head wound was as accurate as I remember it.
What was the first time that you recall, being struck by that? Was it relatively soon after assassination or years later?
Well, the commission report was released in '64. Late
Probably
64.
shortly thereafter.
Shortly after '64, after the commission report. So you probably noticed some newspaper account or TV account that described the wounds, and that it just didn't seem right to you.
And what was the reason again that you did not, as far as your understanding is concerned, why you were not called to testify?
Because I was never asked to have my name released. I was never notified in any form or fashion, so that was the reason.
But you mentioned something about the FBI investigation.
No, they had told us
Clearing
that
your
we
name.
would have to be cleared by the FBI before we would release any information. And since I never talked to anybody about it in the FBI, that...
You've been concerned that you may be still under some sort of restriction, is that it? Or?
Well, I don't know.
No, just as to her failure to appear.
No, there was no failure
I mean,
to
they didn't
appear.
ask you. That's what it comes down to, right?
I was never notified.
So they never conducted a background check or whatever it was on you because they had no intention of calling you. Is that right?
I don't know. I couldn't answer that. Not having ever talked to anybody about it, I do not know.
But
Some of the other nurses who you worked with were called to testify, right?
3.
And you were not called. And did you ever wonder why they called them and not you?
Because I was not cleared initially by the FBI is the way I understand it.
But that was because...
They were all cleared within, I guess, 2 or 3 days
Any idea
after.
why you were not cleared, or
I beg your pardon?
any idea why you were not cleared? What did that clearing process then amount to? You know, did they tell you what they went through to get cleared?
Not specifically that I remember. I know that Mrs. Nelson and Margaret Hinchcliffe and Diana Bowron had talked to the FBI, and what they were told or what they were told not to do, I do not know.
But you never talked with anyone from the FBI at all?
No.
So you just got your instructions from Mrs. Nelson, was that it?
Right.
Not to talk until you've been cleared?
Right.
All right, I think that's all I have.
Yeah,
Anything else?
I'm all set.
Okay. Thank you very much.